In this episode, I sit down with Stuart McAllister and we talk about the church and transition, particularly focusing on some Eastern European conflicts in the post World War II era and which churches struggled in the transition and which one thrived, and then map that onto our modern experience as Western Christians. You'll find this helpful as you think about the way you think about the world, but also as you lead and encourage the Christians around you. As always, if you appreciate what we do, you can like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support us financially, you can do so by visiting www.toltogether.com. Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Nathan Rittenhouse, and today a special privilege to have Stuart McAllister back with us, a fan favorite, because he brings some actual wisdom to these conversations that Cameron and I can kind of bat around in the ether a little bit, and then Stuart can help us put some legs under some of our ideas. But Stuart, one of the just kind of a I don't know, over the last year or two, a category that's been interesting for me is to think about the church in transition. And uh, let's not think about North America for the moment at all, although there are transitions happening there. But I've been going back and reading a lot of, I guess you would call it the OG, the original historical fiction of, from Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth, looking at, the kind of the Chinese peasant up through the
Yes.
revolution. Um,
Oh, yeah.
Things like Sholokov's like Quiet Flows the Dawn, of looking
Mhm.
at kind of the Cossack way of life, very
Yeah.
agrarian, rooted to in that case, a river, a geographic location. And then you have these technological, economic, and political shifts that flip everything
Right.
up through, the Bolshevik revolution. And you can repeat this pattern of just rapid transition and total cultural change within very short periods of time, flipping very quickly. Um, and it's just kind of an interesting to look at the totality of that rather than, oh, in this date, Napoleon did this, to try to think
Right.
more broadly about
Yeah.
life on the ground at that time, because that's how we live and we experience it. And so it kind of got me thinking about, I know you're deeply read in kind of not just military history, but also particularly kind of the Eastern Europe. You have a lot of experience in that. And it's a kind of, I was born in the mid 80s. A lot of the upheaval there was before I was born, and then significant things happening when, I wasn't thinking about anything when I, in 1986.
Right.
And so up to 89 for sure, big, in those years, massive things happening. And so you take the bulk of the listeners to this conversation will have no recollection of
Yes.
kind of that post-war. And then I think, we think, oh, World War II was over in the 40s, and don't really have a conceptualization of the way that that snowball and the outworkings of that splattered throughout the entire, um, particularly Eastern European region. And so if
Right.
you wanna give us just like, as you're thinking, like, things that pop into your head of that time, and then we'll pull in kind of like, and how did the church flourish, perish, get twisted, thrive?
Mm.
This is what I wanna poke you on and hear a little bit about, some of that.
Yeah, well, great to be with you, Nathan, and with your listeners and watchers. I think growing up in Scotland in post-war World War II, Britain, there was also, I mean, I was, of course, a kid coming of age, and you're learning things in school about the British Empire and this kind of stuff, which in my life was actually the very end of it. So it was
Mhm.
literally the tide was going out. And when we watched the news, we had the terrorism in Britain from Northern Ireland with the Irish Republican Army, bombs going off in London and the big cities of Britain, but of course Ireland, where there was much more violence. But equally, there was things like places that I grew up with, like Aden, which is Yemen today. Well, that was a British occupied. The British Army was still there, and in many parts of Africa, there was still British Army, and there was people. You're seeing black and white news reports of attacks. So very much seeing that, and also the post-industrial, being in Scotland, the collapse of like shipbuilding and steel, all the things that had been there during the war were in massive decline because post-war, a lot of that stuff went overseas to other countries. So, and the church equally was in a place of, um, the 60s was a revolution around the world in terms of values. So you had churches that grew, grew up in a kind of a static, if you like, or more a given, a slower pace of life and a particular sense of morality and maybe social ethics. But then the social ethics disappear, the morality gets readjusted, and Christians find themselves, rather than being in a kind of positive place in culture, increasingly moving into the back foot, and that's just in Britain. But when you go to the continent and Europe, you have whole cultures that were first of all brutalized by the Nazi experience, which was a war of total annihilation. I mean, when the Nazis came in, not just the Jews, but the Slavic peoples were hated, the Gypsies, and anybody who didn't form into the Reich's racial theories. So when Stalin and the Russians, of course, fought back, it was equally annihilation coming the other way. But for the people in the middle, and that would be Ukrainians and Poles and Hungarians and Bulgarians, they substituted one slavery for another one. And in between that, there were Christians on the ground who had believed God. I mean, I remember sitting with Baptist men, preaching in this church in Poland. And these old hardened men, at that time, probably in their 60s and that, or 65 or older, but they had been ethnic Germans. So they lived in Poland, but they were ethnically German in roots. So they were basically force recruited into the German army, had to fight for the Germans all the way into Russia, fought all the way back from Russia against the Soviets, and then were captured. And then for many of them, they lived for 10 years as prisoners in the Soviet Union, helping rebuild the Soviet Union, and only came back to Poland, their home, in 1955.
Hmm.
Now, these were Baptist men and women. These were guys who were Bible believing, believing Christians. So you can imagine their life, and you talk about adjustment, talk about living under that, and talk about their families, their parents living with their relatives, um, with no communication at all while they were in the Soviet Union. Did they die or whatever? They may know they were alive, but that was about the minimal amount of communication they could get. So yeah, transition is a huge challenge, and I think culture moves at a rapid rate. Things can go for very stably for a period of time, and then either from technology, war, some other factor comes in, and boom, you're in an acceleration. And often we find ourselves unprepared for that. And I think the danger is that we react out of emotion and seeking power rather than going to the scriptures, to God, and being coordinated by the things that God has given us, the eternal things, the eternal over the, if you like, kairos over chronos in terms
Hmm.
of time, you know?
Say something about, because it strikes me as interesting that how and I show my ignorance here and just ask a question that may or may not even make sense. But there it seemed to me that some of those, so you said, culture can go along for, along for a very long time, and then you get these massive disrupting forces. And it seems like one of the main disrupting forces there is the displacement. So you think of these guys that are hauled off to another, country for 10 years. But that there was a way in which Christianity, Eastern or Orthodox Christianity, kind of got rooted in the nature of the cycles of the seasons and the church calendar and the language and the um it's so you go back and you don't, you certainly shouldn't idealize any of those orally, or we would call more primitive at this point, agriculturally based systems, but they were more native and they were more rooted in the structure. And uh, so it seems like the Christianity was more, um, was culturally deeper and interwoven into everything
Well,
from the dress
I,
to the.
yeah, I
What am
think
I? What am I trying to say here? It doesn't feel like that.
let me see if I could take a shot of
Okay.
interpret what
Yeah.
I think you're trying to say. Um, okay, so Christianity classically transmitted across the hundreds and or 1500 years, Christendom, if you like. But it took on a different face in Orthodoxy, and then from the Catholicism, and then in the Reformation with the Protestant countries. But what they had in common was that there was a cosmic order. There was an order that God was in the heavens, the earth had a rhythm, that there were seasons, and the church calendar and the agricultural calendar kind of were in sync in a way, because the church followed, the life of Jesus, creation, fall, resurrection, and particularly around the events of Easter, which also coincided with spring and the new birth and planting and all this kind of thing. And it was connected in many ways to the Jewish calendar in terms of the feasts, which were then
Hmm.
fulfilled by Christ. So there was a rhythm, there was a narrative, there was a structure. What modernity does when it comes in is you have secularization that leads to pluralization. It multiplies the amount of belief systems, if you like, and then increasingly over time, privatization. So those structures, not all at once, but in the case of the totalitarians, the Nazis or the Soviets, was that the church part particularly was to be warned against. Any metaphysical claim, any claim to authority of morality or structure or rhythm had to be either destroyed or subsumed into the Nazi way of life or the communist way of life, or I would say today, the economic imperialism of our time, in which, consumerism does the same thing to the church in a way.
Okay, well let's go there because this is the question that I have in my mind is I'm reading historically and I'm watching what are the key elements that have destroyed and it's wild to live in a time and again, we in my lifetime I've experienced nothing that's even remotely on the level of brutality and bloodshed and loss. I'm not undermining that, not downplaying that. I recognize there's a catastrophic monumental difference there. The flip side is I do feel like we're living in a time in which we watch the collapse of the there's some sort of similarity here that's happened without the bloodshed.
Oh, yeah, without doubt.
Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
I
and so I'm
used
trying
to
to decide
say,
what's just coincidental there and what's an actual, um, cultural or metaphysical. So I feel like, if I look sideways at my generation, people do feel displaced. They do feel they don't have a story, they don't have a rhythm, they don't have a history or a cultural or a
I
and
think
so
the
it's
difference
like
may
living
be,
among a displaced people that never experienced a war.
but let me, I think the difference is that when I used to visit the States coming from Europe, I got the impression that America almost was, rather than being a nation, was more of a market, because I found Christians talking and people talking always about the stock market, the Dow, and all that, which we do. You hear on so we thought in economic terms we were economized to such a degree. And I had a feeling that whilst persecution was the law of Christians in Eastern Europe and China and many parts of the Muslim world, that seduction was a far greater effect in the United States and in many parts of what became, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, and so forth. So the underlying assumption of materialism and the vision of um, the self, the loss of a sense of community and purpose, but that life exists for the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. And that becomes the summum bonum. Now, and that can be defined by any lifestyle. So the idea of community, and particularly you're thinking about a nation and shared visions, e pluribus unum, that goes out the window, because you're not, who cares about the unum as long as there's a market and my toys and I've got my cable television and I've got my iPad and whatever.
Mhm.
I can construct and consume the life that I want. And I think you ask questions from a place of a deep, not only a deep sense of an embedded community, but from a deep longing for the breadth of that to spread, that we are connected to the earth.
Mhm.
We're connected, obviously, primarily to God initially. We're connected to others by virtue of birth and heritage. And we are connected morally and responsibly for the execution of the kind of life we should have together. There's moral things like truth, justice, righteousness, equity, rightly defined, are things we should be concerned about.
Yeah.
But increasingly in a consumerist world, it's like, "Oh, I don't care, because as long as I'm getting mine, you know, I don't
Yeah.
care about anybody else," kind of thing.
So I guess this is me speculating that I feel like I live in a time, and for those chronologically coming behind me who have recognized the shortcomings of this, but have no clue how to begin to put something back together.
Right.
That seems to me, and so absolutely we can't, and you have the rise of the interest in Wendellberry and all of that kind of thing. But I know good and well that nature is not a clear enough vision for unity. Well, I know that, and so I'm watching people grasp for things that I know look nice for about 18 months, but they aren't enough to create a vision of to use Paul Kingsnorth categories of a place and a people and a past and a prayer
Right.
of of we're seeking meaning, but it's not just meaning. We're looking for shared meaning, and we're
Right.
no good at it. That's kind of what it feels like.
A place for us to go in this. I think this is where like Matthew chapter 13, the parables of the kingdom of God, Jesus said, is like a mustard seed. So we have to have that mustard seed kind of vision of life. The strategy, it seems, that God has employed in the New Testament is the placing of his word and his people. So his word in people and those people with
Mhm.
the word in them in places. And I think that's the Christian vision of subversion, that God places people, Daniel's, Esther's, David's, Joseph in Egypt with the Pharaoh. across time. And in the modern world, sends out people like the Apostle Paul and the apostles, scattering these seeds everywhere, and the seeds plant in the midst of despotic power, the Roman Empire, and with no power, no authority, no economic well-being, no strength, no backup, no non-profit organizations, no internet, none of the above. But they had the word of God, the power of the Holy Spirit, and the drive of mission, and God used them. We must beware that we're not children of the technocratic age where we need a complete strategy for everything. Unless we
Mhm.
could come up with a vision, a plan, an organ, a strategy, we find ourselves lost. I think in times like this, in transition, we go to the coordinates that God has given us based in worship, um, integrity, living out faithfulness, and service. So
Mhm.
service within to those around us, within our communities, our church, witness to the world. We testify, we share, and we act responsibly. And then we look for co-belligerents. We find others who share with, even in our faith or outside it, people who share similar coordinates, if you like, that we
Yeah.
can align with for common goods, common well-being.
Well,
But not waiting for the bigger picture. I think at the higher level, Nathan, because of technology, because of money, because of unregulated power, you're in a world in which this is a little bit like the Lord of the Rings. One ring to rule them all, one ring
mhm.
to find them, one ring to bind them all, and in that darkness bind them. Well, that 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 issue today is power. It always has been. And so we are fighting against speaking truth to power, not just truth to power to say who wins the political. There's a metaphysical dimension of this. It's the escalation of the conflict that is all seen all the way through the Bible, and
Mhm.
of ultimately leading to the final worship when the king comes back and says it's done, and the trumpets blow and Christ shall come, and we will celebrate. But until then, we have to live through the mess and the muddle of the daily complexity of life, trying to be faithful and focused in our life.
A statement, a follow-up statement and a question then. So, as you were making this list of the Daniels and the Esthers and the Josephs, and on through scripture, it should jump out to us that none of those stories came about by advanced human strategic planning. There wasn't any like, "Oh, if we could get Joseph sold into slavery, he could rise into power into, the upper levels of the," or, if we could get Esther, um, and so there's a little bit of that faithful presence idea there that I very much appreciate with your perspective on this. I guess one of the question then that comes out of that is, so you grow up Scotland, the British experience, your testimony is for another time, but you weren't super interested in the things of the church during that period. Then, um, you know, the Lord gets a hold of you, and we're all grateful for that. And then off you go into the mission field, and then into the Eastern Europe side of things. And so then you're in, what years would that have been? The 80s or
Uh,
so?
1978.
78.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
1978, and we lived in Austria until 1998, so 20 years.
Okay.
So we lived through the actual fall of the Iron Curtain and the
Yeah, I was laughing showing my kids the other day. I have a globe that still has Czechoslovakia on it. So that's my modern artifact, I guess. The so as you're pushing into these areas,
Mhm.
what fragments of the church are still there? What are you connecting with? And what is I'm curious about their post desolation reconstitution, I guess. Were you doing first time biblical contact, or were you finding some glowing coals and embers that needed to be fanned into flame there? And how are those people hanging on after all this?
Well, during the Cold War years itself, that we were working with very much living believers. We were working with churches that were either some that were above ground, but most that were underground in some capacity, or trying to be as low key as they could be. But they still received literature, Bibles, materials, songbooks, children's stuff for camps, where they would take kids off for Bible training to the mountains in Poland or in Bulgaria and Romania and all this kind of thing. So there was the period itself in which they were very, largely very vibrant. Of course, the people that received the literature would be the more serious Christians because they were
Mhm.
willing to face jail sentences, and that happened, or getting denounced by neighbors if they were caught, or Westerners were seen coming to their houses. But then in the post-war years, that was a time of confusion for all because you had you had the collapse of a system of total domination and shepherding, the nanny state on steroids that basically didn't function fully, but functioned at a level that everybody was, it was the norm. And then the free market comes in, and all of a sudden people find out their currency isn't worth as much, that new moralities are coming in, television programs from the West, pornography and all the usual stuff that comes in the tail of that. And the church found it quite hard to make the adjustment in the initial. The leaders who had been raised under communism were trained to kind of watch and shepherd. So they had a very hands-on, a bit controlling in terms of the
Hmm.
church. And they didn't find it easy to let it up. So and then some of the innovations when people came in from America, from Britain, from young, trendy looking Christians with guitars and noise. I mean, I remember being called in several times to mediate. And a couple of people I admire very deeply uh, didn't make the transition very well. In fact, one guy in particular, I headed off a crisis where the people loved him to death, but they now saw him, a hero who had suffered for the faith and been imprisoned. They saw him as one of the major obstacles to growth, and to try and get him gently to step aside so the church could move into this new era and advance with the gospel, advance with the new conditions, the context and conditions that had changed. It wasn't easy for them
This
to
is
do that.
I'm so glad I asked you about this because this is raising a whole lot of fascinating questions in my mind. And so just let me repeat this back and make sure that I have this right. So, um, underground church maintains some vibrancy. It maintains a leadership structure. There's you're part of, and there's a broader literature being smuggled around and
Right.
all that sort of thing. And so the church adapts to that culture. Functionally speaking, it's operating. You're not putting an advertisement in the local newspaper or a radio program of what the kids. Um, so that's happening because I think there's a part of us to say that in a time of physical persecution, that would be the hardest. And it's interesting that you've said that actually that wasn't, and while that had its challenges, the bigger questions happened was, okay, so we have a stable thing going along here. It's not good, but it's stable. And then quickly things change into theoretically a better political economic,
Mhm.
future. But the church struggled with that
Oh,
term
big
into,
time. Mhm. And in fact, there were leaders. I would meet people. There were people that they got just like you actually, sorry, just like you actually get also amongst the wider population. There became almost a nostalgia for communism, because
hmm,
in a sense the enemy was defined, the situation was defined. You knew what you're fighting against. When capitalism came in and changed, the game changed drastically. And rather than people being controlled, they were so-called set free. But many people have never been able to live with freedom. Freedom is a problem as well as a blessing, because, and I think we've discussed this in previous episodes, but when freedom comes in and you haven't had a chance to experimentation, trying things out and getting your fingers burned becomes an issue. And the older people who live with very tight guardrails can then become seen as problems because they can't allow enough bandwidth to do the necessary expansion into freedom, positive freedom.
hmm,
They only live by negative freedom. And I think that's where the Christian coordinate of always defining, well, what do we mean by I'm free? Paul said that. You see in the New Testament, Paul, many of the letters, I think Corinthians and others, were written trying to explain what Christian liberty was and what it was not. So although he was an apostle, he was free to do certain things, but he wouldn't do certain things with in certain people. He wouldn't do some things at all, but there's other things he wouldn't even do if he knew it caused someone to stumble. So this was the kind of thing, what was allowable, and that's always, I think, one of the challenges. What does it mean to be free, but responsible? Or I think Oz would use the phrase ordered liberty.
yeah,
So, and that
okay.
was very much a question. I think that's what America was born into, but has then left. And so now freedom is disordered liberty. We want liberty, but without the order part.
So let's step back once and then go forward once here. So what were the characteristics of the people who did, of the churches and the leaders and the Christians who did make that? I'm not saying that wasn't difficult for anybody, but and I think I know what you're going to say here, but there surely were examples of
Mhm,
groups or of people that navigated that transition well. And I'm
mhm.
sure you noticed a couple of things about what made those work uniquely well during that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, even in the same country, there were two people in contrast. There was one guy in particular who we worked with a lot and brought a lot of literature, and he was a real risk taker. I mean, he really saw God move, taking literature and being stopped by the police with literature in his car and not getting caught. They didn't find the literature, and his own father-in-law had probably been murdered by the secret police in his country, and he moved quite well because he was very missional. He was very outgoing. He recognized the changes, but he'd already been doing work, what I would say, at a much more worldview, says developing his thinking about economics and other things as things were beginning to happen. Many of the others had not. The gentleman I was thinking of that I was kind of alluding to was, although had been an academic at one time, had really gone into a very narrow world of a kind of a very almost a fundamentalist biblical model, and he didn't have categories to work with. I don't think he had things like creation, fall, redemption, and eschaton. I mean, he had genuinely redemptive sense of Jesus is alive, the gospel is true, preach the, but it was a very black and white world. Everything, it was very
Mhm.
clear, and he had no room for gray or nuance. And I think part of the thing that these leaders were was an openness to explore and still be able to say no, but you had to grow into things. Well, what is the biblical picture? I had to test the waters and apply my ethics and my morality and prayer and discernment as you move into the new world. It's not a fixed world. It's not a set in concrete, one size fits all for all time. Um, and then you can
Mhm.
adapt to the changing realities.
Well, so what I'm wondering in this is, as I'm listening to you say that, and then trying to apply that to, we made some kind of allusions or correlations between the moment which we're living in, this time of great disruption, and it does seem to me that out of a very real sense of gospel faithfulness and of, looking around culturally, that a lot of the work of the church right now can be into, we're going to define the evil. That's, that's all laid out clearly for us everywhere we look, and then that the work of the church becomes in maintaining and defending the church against XYZ. That doesn't have, so it's interesting to me that you said that the guy who made it had a missional concept of, this is a continue, even coming out of a personally difficult time. um, the church is continuing to lean forward and see that as part of its posture toward the world, rather than just being defined in the negative sense of, how do we how do, so instead of saying, how do we not fall apart, how do we multiply, is is a posture that helps us kind of keep our eyes up in a helpful way.
Well, if you take a purely defensive posture, in other words, you're living your life by threat. Everything is a fearful issue. Everything is a danger. Everything can make the catastrophic your faith collapse, your life be compromised, your spiritual and all of this stuff. Living by fear and not by faith. And I think one of the things, I mean, learning like even from the Marines, who were often taught, all the procedures at combat and things, but they knew that when a battle began, things would change. So you had these steady procedures in your head and the tools that were given to you for combat, but you also learned that in a context of conflict, you have to be able to adapt, innovate, and improvise. So as a Christian, I get this surety of God's word that's given to us. We have the scriptures, the prophetic word made more sure, as it says in Peter. And we have regular reading and soaking in the narrative, the story, regular prayer and communion that keeps me in tune with God. And then in the openness of life, as things change, I have to adapt, innovate, and improvise. I'm not innovating in the sense of changing the script. I'm applying God's word to this context. I'm listening
Mhm.
with God for obedience in the here and now. In this context, with these people, under these circumstances, in this moment.
Yeah, I imagine everybody listening along is like, "That's great, Stuart," um, and that's true, and I can even say, from my own experience, I remember when I was at Gordon Conwell and speaking a lot in, colleges and campuses up in New England, that there were many times I'd be sitting in a seminary class and think, "That is absolutely true. I agree with that, and that is absolutely not the way I'm gonna start talking about it when I get to the college campus this evening."
Yeah.
And so it wasn't a difference in the fundamental truths. It was okay, actually, it sneaks up on you. This book is now 20 years old.
Right.
this sociological idea has,
Yep.
and so this rapid change that I think is difficult for Christians and for church leaders to say, okay, where's the actual solid rock here? What are the things that are flexible, and what are the things that if we bend them, the whole thing comes crashing down? Um, but that's not fear mongering. It's just the reality of what it means to be human. And I think some of the questions I'm asking you is drawing out. Hey, there have been faithful Christian people who have done this very well for a very long time.
Yeah, and there was a phrase I was just looking for because took a note to myself of this. Sometimes I look for things like mnemonic devices, things that will help me in my memory. But there was something I read this morning. I can't even remember the context, but it was talking about um, the clock, the calendar, and the compass. And I thought, so a clock is a symbol of what's the time. So what time am I in? That's like you're saying. So you've gone from your theology class to your student encounter. Your calendar is the kind of the depth, the stuff that you've known. There's things that I can achieve here in this limited time. And your compass, I think, is the true north that you're aiming for. I want to think about honoring God. I want to love Him with all my heart. I want to glorify Him. So there are pieces that we have given that we have to think of adapting to the context. And I think part is bringing to consciousness the applications of some of the tool sets that we have and using them in the moment in
Hmm.
a more robust way. And then sharing the experience. It's not just a one time for all, but you can testimonies, I think, in a church, the life experience of people in the university or people in the mechanics workshop or people working in the medical, whatever field it's in, they share anecdotally how they have seen Christ manifest, the Spirit working, and that becomes a part of our intelligence that we have to then field that intelligence back into. Well, I'm not doing exactly that, but the same Spirit, the same God is with me. And I'm praying, I'm asking, show me, Lord, how I might, and I'm inspired by the example of God working in them and their example of modeling like that. So I think that's part of it. We learn together as we journey together, but we navigate by the fixed points. What are the navigational points that we're aiming
Hmm.
towards? What does that
Hmm.
look like? What's the good that I am living for today? In this circumstance, what's the good that I can bring to someone? Can I be kind? Can I just talk to them, love on them, pray for them, say, look, I know you're in terrible distress. Can I help them in some physical way? Is there financial or some other aid I can give? Is there some practical? So there's always something we can do. And even they say, well, all I can do is pray. Well, it's not all you can do. That's a massive thing. If someone comes and prays for you, you're bringing the God of heaven to bear into a circumstance.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of thing. Get more of a hopeful, transformative. You see, Nathan, one of the things that bothers me about our moment, and I said this the other, I think we talked about this last week. There's when we're talking about culture, there's too much cynicism on all levels. We think we're too analytical, we're all too clever, we're also yes, but we're all doing sort of the postmodern thing. All of us, I think. And that leads to, in the soul, a type of despair
Hmm.
because we become so seeing through and analyzing that our soul, by definition, becomes weary because we don't see hope. We don't expect hope. And well, God will work best, but someday, but that's way, way, we think. Meanwhile, we are down here in the mud, in the mess, in the muddle. Well, we're not alone. Though I am
Hmm.
with you always, even to the end of the age. And we need to recover that sense of faith, hope, and courage day by day. And so what you were talking about in transition, the overwhelming positive characteristics were those who embraced their moment because they embraced their God in the moment.
There's the line.
That makes a difference.
Yeah. I think practically speaking, the way that my wife and I have been praying about this is to say, Lord, would you help us cling firmly to what we need to cling firmly to and
Right.
be open handed where we need to be open handed. And
Yeah.
so to have this sense of what are we really latching down to? And then what's just cultural silliness or what is ephemeral that we're
Yes.
being told by a cultural moment, you have to have this, you have to do this. Um, that actually really isn't part of the actual gospel marching
All
order.
is vanity and the striving after wind. And I mean, you do see the ephemeral, the thinness, the hable, the weakness of so much that passes for value and structure and importance and relevance and cool. And you have to, all of this, these are manufactured values that then camp in my soul and give me a sense of what is important and necessary. But it's lies, it's propaganda. It's not all bad. The good things are lasting, and the eternal shines through the created order, the loving things that God has given. But there's a lot more fun in the mundane, the normal, the regular, the seeming not as important, sexy, or powerful. But it's a transcendent realism that breaks through when we trust God, believe Him, and don't live with sticky fingers.
Yeah. Well, I like your thought there about understanding the moment, but trusting God in the moment is the key there. And so I think for those of you who are listening and you're thinking about, remove the plank from your own eye, um, we have to be honest about the way in which these things do seep and saturate into our consciousness, our secular moment here. And so there's a lot of work for us to do individually, but then I think a lot of you listening are also in some form of leadership, whether it's a family or a church or a business or organization or something, and to be thinking about the way in which you can foster proper worship, which does help us clarify what are we really about here. But then also, I think just the room to say, hey, some of these things are silly, and to call them for what they are, and to work to be a people and to be part of a people and be fostering in our own lives the ability to say, here's the compass work. Here's true magnetic north. This is the triune God who is, and we orient around what He calls us to, and then we look at the calendar and then we look at the clock on the day of the day and the monthly and the yearly thing. But if we can have that long term perspective, then we recognize that some of these hamster wheel moments that flip around in our culture, um, we can provide the on Christ the solid rock I stand.
I remember, Nathan, a moment with a dear friend. It was in the Easter season many, many years ago. I was in New England, and this was the pastor founder of a really wonderful church, a lot of blue collar people, just a very mixed, big, loving church. And he, just before I was about to speak, he was talking about the Easter moment, and he was talking about God's love and the incarnation. And he said, he talked about the fact of, Ferraris and European chocolates and all these things that we find so special. And then he talked about God's love, a love so special, he said, it had to be imported. And I think that's part of what this is about. We can have this conversation because that love was imported already. But
Mhm.
maybe in some of the moments of our life when we're in that darkness is to import that love again, to realize that there's a love here, there's an agape, there is something in the cosmos, in the circumstances, in my life that would not be there had Christ not come and died for us and then had been risen. So there's a love so special. There's something shed abroad that is here and is growing and is the basis of true spiritual revolution. And that's where we keep our eyes on.
Stuart, I think we'll end it there. It's great words to end on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.